I often say that aviation safety is, at least in part, written in blood. And that's because so many of the lessons that made flying as safe as it is in the 21st century actually came from tragedies who showed us where we needed to get better. And we did get better. Commercial aviation just keeps getting safer and safer all the time, and in fact, you're much safer flying now than you were just a decade or two ago. Our planes are better, air traffic control is more skilled, and the pilots, including those in charge of your next flight, are now safer and better trained than they've ever been. But what kind of qualities does a pilot actually need in order to respond correctly and decisively when faced with a sudden and catastrophic situation? Well, that's the subject of this supercut video that you're about to see. My goal is to show you how skills, training and decades of experience have shaped today's pilots, and to do that I will show you 4 examples of when pilots really saved the day even when the odds were stacked against them. The accident that I'm going to start with isn't the oldest, but it's definitely one of the most legendary. This is the story of the miracle on the Hudson, but this miracle was only made possible because both of these pilots had the skills needed for something known as short-term decision-making. Good training, plenty of flight experience and excellent knowledge of their aircraft systems. So I want you to really focus on their short-term decision-making here and think of how you can apply this knowledge to improve your own skills to make you better equipped when faced with a sudden crisis. So this story that I'm going to tell you today, guys, is probably one of the most heavily publicized stories for the last few decades. There have been Hollywood movies made about them, there have been tens of articles in different publications all over the world. But what I am going to give you is the insight from a pilot's perspective. I am going to tell you this story based on the final report of this incident. I have linked to the final report down here. It's almost 200 pages of great content if you're interested in reading it, and any other sources that I'm using are also linked to in the description of the video. So US Airways Flight 1549, or their official call sign Cactus 1549, took place on the 15th of January 2009. There were 150 passengers on board, including 1 infant in the lap of his mom and 5 crew members. The captain of the flight was Captain Chesley Sullenberger, a very experienced ex-military pilot, and assisting him was an equally or almost equally experienced first officer called Jeffrey Skiles. The aircraft is an Airbus A320 equipped with 2 CFM56 engines. This flight was the last flight on a 4-day kind of route for the crew, so they were basically going home, and this was the second flight on the day of the same aircraft. On the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, since this was such a relatively short flight, it meant that you could follow the whole CVR recording from when the pilots were doing their pre-flight, and you can tell that the pre-flight was just normal. It's actually a little bit spooky looking at the pre-flight from a pilot's perspective, because you can see how these guys obviously had no clue about what was going to happen. They were joking around, some minor mistakes were being made with the load sheets that was being corrected by ground load control. There was some issues with Jeff's transmission button on his side that they were talking about putting into the tech log, and kind of minor things like that. So the aircraft taxied out for a takeoff runway 04 in LaGuardia Airport in New York. Everything looking completely normal. The first officer, Jeff Skiles, was the pilot flying for the leg. He was the one that's going to actually fly the aircraft. And taking care of the radios and doing the pilot monitoring work was Captain Sullenberger. Now, before we go into the actual flight, there's a couple of things that I want you to know. All right. The first thing is about First Officer Jeffrey Skiles. So Jeffrey, or Jeff, was a very highly experienced first officer. He had more than 15,000 hours, and he'd flown on many types before, including the Fokker 100 and the Boeing 737. But he had just started flying the Airbus A320. In fact, he had just done his skill test on New Year's Eve 2008, only 16 days before this flight, and he had only clocked about 37 hours on the day of the accident. Right? This is going to be important in the way that he deals with his role during this incident. The other thing that I want you to know about is this aircraft, right? In the fleet of US Airways at the time, you had Airbus 320s that were equipped for extended over water use and aircraft that were not, right? The difference between the two was that the aircraft that were equipped to fly over water had life vests for all of the passengers on board, but they also had special emergency exit chutes that could be used as emergency rafts if needed. And those were connected both on the forward to emergency exit and the aft to emergency exit. So just out of pure luck, this aircraft on this day, even though they were not scheduled to fly over water, was one of the aircraft that was equipped for extended over water use. At time 15:24:54, because actually the seconds are important here, Cactus 1549 received their takeoff clearance on runway 04. They started rolling down the runway, everything looking fine. Jeff made a normal takeoff, and at about 700 feet they changed controller from the tower controller in LaGuardia to the departure controller in the New York area. Captain Sully checked in on the radio, stated that it was 700 feet, climbing to 5,000 feet, and the controller read back that he was clear to continue to climb to 15,000 feet, which was then acknowledged. Now, about 2 minutes into the flight, you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder how Captain Sully calls out "birds," followed almost immediately by the sound of some kind of muffled thumps on the CVR and the sound of the engines rolling back. The aircraft is now at 2,815 feet and about 4.5 nautical miles north-northeast of their takeoff runway in LaGuardia. Now, what has actually happened at this point is that the aircraft has impacted with a flock of migratory Canada geese. Okay? A Canada goose is a large bird. Right? It can weigh up to about 8 pounds. And that's important because during the certification of the Airbus 320 and the CFM56 engines, they have been certified to be able to take bird strikes. But the birds used during the certification for testing purposes only weighed about 2 to 2.5 pounds. So a Canada goose is almost 3 times bigger than the birds used for certification. During examinations of the engines after the accident, it was found that at least 2 Canada geese was ingested into each engine. One of them seemed to have hit the outer part of the fan and then subsequently been thrown out through the bypass duct, but at least 1 goose in each engine went straight into the engine core, damaging the inlet guide vanes and also damaging quite a lot of the first part of the low pressure compressor. Now, these damages in themselves would have made sufficient damage to the engines to flame them out and to make them unable to start up again. But of course, the pilots up in the front of the aircraft had no idea about the damage that the engines had suffered. Whether it's navigating turbulence or ensuring a smooth crosswind landing, pilots are the ones that are tasked with ensuring the ultimate safety of the passengers and crew. And whilst not all of us might be in charge of the safety of hundreds of people, that doesn't mean that we won't face tricky challenges, especially when we're out traveling. That's why I am so happy to introduce today's sponsor, Saily, the eSIM app that ensures that you're always connected, no matter where your travels takes you. Saily has been developed by the experts over at Nord, which is a brand that we use extensively here on the channel, and they have made sure to offer affordable data plans in over 150 countries so far, which is awesome. I actually used them myself just a few weeks ago when I flew over to Dubai, and it worked like a charm. So, what do you need to do in order to use them then? Well, it is super easy. You just download the Saily app, which is available on both iOS and Android, and then you choose the country that you're going to, which data plan you want, then you follow the instructions to install the eSIM, and then you just activate it. And the pro tip here is to activate your plan when you're just about to leave at your gate. That way, it's already working when you land. I just love how easy it is to use and to track how much data I'm using. It's super nifty, and now there's no need to keep swapping physical SIM cards anymore. So if you want to give Saily a try, then use the link here below, which is saily.com/pilot with the code PILOT for an awesome 15% discount when you do your first purchase. That's saily.com/pilot and the code PILOT. Write it down so you remember it for the next time that you go traveling. Thank you, Saily, for making this extended video possible. Now let's continue. Now, immediately after the bird strike, the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, is picking up the First Officer Jeff Skiles saying, "Uh-oh," and Captain Sully saying, "We have both engines are rolling back." Okay, it's important because the quicker that you realize what's happening to you, the quicker you can start acting on it. You would definitely feel, if you're doing the climb out in a Boeing 737 or an Airbus 320 and you lose both engines, the aircraft will feel like it's basically almost hitting a wall, right? It loses all momentum forward. So to figure out that you have a problem with both engines would probably be fairly easy to do. But what happens next is really impressive. And that is only 2 seconds later, Captain Sully says, "I'm starting the APU and I have controls." The fact that he's taking controls is normal. It's normal procedures by US Airways at the time that the captain takes control during a situation like this, letting the first officer become the pilot monitoring and dealing with subsequent checklist. But what's really impressive is that he had the clarity of mind to start the APU. Now, this was not part of any memory items. It was not part of a QRA checklist. He just did this from memory because he realized the situation that they were in and the fact that they are very close to the ground and they're going to have very little time. And it's going to turn out the fact that he started the APU this early is going to have a huge effect on the rest of the flight. Only 10 seconds later, Captain Sully, who's now the pilot flying of the aircraft, calls for the QRH, the quick reference checklist, to be actioned by Jeff Skiles. And he also sends out a Mayday, Mayday, Mayday message to air traffic control, stating the type of emergency he has and that he's turning back to LaGuardia. The Mayday part, unfortunately, is not heard by ATC because another aircraft is transmitting at the same time. But the fact that this whole procedure, that what we've heard up until now, only had taken about 12 seconds, shows a very high level of situational awareness on behalf of the flight crew. Only a few seconds later, Jeff Skiles is starting to work on the checklist. Okay. Now, remember how I told you that Jeff Skiles had just finished his type rating course? Yeah, you can kind of tell that here, because for anyone who has been out of the simulator for a while or has only done maybe some recurrent training every 6 months, it would take a while to kind of get your wits around you and to find the correct checklist. But it only took Jeff Skiles a few seconds. And that's likely because during the type rating course, you practice a lot of different malfunctions and you deal a lot with the quick reference handbook. So he would have very quickly realized what he was looking at, that he had a dual engine failure, and reached for and started actioning the failure dual engine failure checklist on the quick reference handbook. Now, worth pointing out here as well is that as Jeff and Sully are now starting to deal with the consequences of this bird strike, they're still heading away from the airport. And during the subsequent investigation, it was shown that if they had immediately after they realized that they had lost both engines, started a turn back to LaGuardia, they would have had a chance to land on the runway they departed for or runway 13. However, that is not humanly possible, right? The way that we are trained as pilots is that when something happens, you do not react straight away, because the likelihood is that if you do that, you're going to make a huge mistake. The way that we are trained is to fly the aircraft, make sure it's flyable, look at the problem we have, and only react with kind of our backbone reactions if something is required to keep the aircraft flying, right? And this is what the crew is already doing. To think that they would just realize that bird strike, dual engines, turn, that is not possible. In fact, I think that these guys are reacting with lightning speed at this point from all the kind of experience I have from watching people in the simulator. The fact that they, within the first 20 seconds, have gotten the APU started and started working on the correct checklist and gotten a Mayday call in is amazing work, right? But it also means that their options are diminishing. The further away you go from the airport without engines, the smaller the chances that you're going to be able to return. And this is clearly seen because at this point, Sully is now talking to air traffic control. The reason it's Sully who's doing the radio and not Jeff Skiles is that normally when we have an emergency, the pilot who's working on the checklist concentrates on working on the checklist. The pilot who's flying also does the radio if he or she feels that they have the capacity to do so. Now, air traffic control, who knows what's happening, is trying to give options to Cactus 1549. They're telling them basically that all of the runways on LaGuardia is open. Sully is indicating that he probably won't be able to do that. Now, Sully is now most likely weighing in on his options, okay? He knows that the aircraft reached a maximum altitude of about 3,000 feet before they started to descend. He knows that he needs to keep his speed fairly stable, and he's watching out for different things to do. Remember that they are flying over one of the most densely populated areas in the world here, over New York City. And any turn he would do to try to get back to LaGuardia would also force him to fly in over Manhattan, okay? Now, something that you learn during your flight training is that if you have no engines and you're turning, you're losing more altitude than if you're flying straight ahead. So Sully would know that if he decides to make a turn back to LaGuardia, he's going to lose so much altitude that he will be out of choices then. All right? Either he reaches LaGuardia or he is going to have to land short of the runway, potentially in a very densely populated area. And that is not a nice situation to be in. In fact, the only thing that he sees is either looking straight ahead, where he sees Teterboro Airport, but realizes quickly that Teterboro is just too far away. It's 9 miles away or so. And then he sees this nice open strip, which is the Hudson River. So at a fairly early stage, you can hear through the communication with air traffic control how Sully is starting to kind of leaning towards going down into Hudson. And that is likely because he understands that he doesn't have any other real options at this point. During the descent now, Sully is obviously flying the aircraft, looking out for where he's going to go, and Jeff Skiles is working hard on the checklist. Okay, he's reading through checklist item by checklist item, but something that becomes clear at this point is that the dual engine failure checklist for the Airbus A320 was not made for a dual engine failure just after takeoff. In fact, this checklist was made for what was thought to be the most likely scenario, which is an engine failure or a dual engine failure at high altitude. So it includes things like, increase speed to 300 knots in order to windmill the engines to be able to start them. They have a quick discussion about this. Jeff basically says, increase speed to 300, we don't have that. And Sully responds to, no, we don't. And because a lot of the checklist is basically not made for the situation they find themselves in, they are going to, or he is going to have to work through the checklist just doing what he thinks that he can do. And this is not a nice situation to be in for any pilot at any point. But what we have to look at here, and something that they do great, is that they keep the roles divided. Right? Sully is concentrating on flying the aircraft, looking after a plan where to land, and Jeff is trying to do his absolute best to use the checklist to restart at least one of the engines, because if they can do that, they can get the aircraft flying again and get it back onto a runway rather than into the Hudson. At time 15:29, so this is just about 2 minutes after the engine failure, Sully takes up the PA mic and calls, "This is the captain, brace for impact." Okay, this is crucial because remember, up until this point, there hasn't been any discussion with cabin crew. They would have noticed that something's wrong, that it's gone very, very quiet inside of the cabin, but they don't know how much time they have. But by Sully calling this, they know, brace for impact normally comes just before you impact the water. So it would indicate to the cabin crew that they have a no time available emergency on their hands, and they need to communicate to the passengers to basically just go into brace positions for potential emergency landing. Now, another thing that is worth pointing out here is that during the descent, Captain Sully, who's now probably looking out the windows most of the time, is gradually losing speed. During the subsequent investigation, he stated that he thought that he was following what's called the green dot speed, which is a safe speed to follow, and that he only reduced back to the F speed, the foxtrot speed, which is the approach speed, when they had flaps out. But in fact, the speed had been steadily deteriorating all the time as he's now descending. And as they're descending in, they're also getting a lot of different warnings, right? They're getting beeps from the aircraft telling them about the different failures that are being associated with the dual engine failures, but they're also getting a TCAS warning, because as they're now descending in over central New York, there's loads of helicopters around. They trigger some TCAS warnings, but also, crucially, they're getting ground proximity warning systems, warnings, GPWS warnings. Okay. Now, if they would have had the ditching checklist, which is a separate checklist, that checklist actually tells them to turn off the GPWS warning system, because they're not supposed to get these kind of spurious warnings that doesn't help them. But since they're reading through the dual engine failure checklist, that is not telling them to do so. And another thing that is really important to remember here is that when the Airbus 320 is constructed, it is constructed to kind of layer different warnings on top of each other depending on how crucial they are. And the GPWS warning is considered to be one of the most important warnings. It's basically telling the pilot that they're about to fly into a mountain. So any warnings that could be sounding at this point is going to be muted by the GPWS warning. So the fact that they're getting terrain, pull up warnings mutes other warnings. And in this case, the speed warning that they would have gotten, that Sully would have had if it weren't for the fact that the GPWS warning system was constantly sounding. So he is now getting lower and lower and lower on speed. Around 15:29:20, so about 2.5 minutes after the initial engine failure, First Officer Jeff Skiles starts to realize that he's not able to restart the engines. He still continues, he still move around the switches according to the checklist, but he's also indicating to Sully that, this doesn't seem to be working. And just about 20 seconds later, Sully asks for flaps, right? Just give me flaps. Jeff gives him flaps. 30 seconds later, Jeff calls out that, okay, you have flaps, and he gives him a speed readout. You have 170 knots, you're 250 feet. Have you got any power? Indicating that, try just to put the thrust levels up, see if any of them would respond, even though it doesn't look like it. Nothing, obviously, is coming out. Jeff then asks, you have flaps 2, do you want more? And Sully responds that, no, we'll stay with flaps 2. This was discussed during the subsequent investigation, whether or not this was the right call to do. Sully said that he had, in his experience, choosing flaps 3 rather than flaps 2 would just give more drag, and flaps 2 would give him a better kind of nose attitude as he was hitting the water. And that was, agreed to by the investigation committee as well. So at this point, they're now coming very close to the water. And Sully is starting to prepare for the flare. But remember how I told you that the speed was low? Well, it turns out that below 200 feet, they're actually 15 to 19 knots below the SL speed, which is kind of the lowest speed that gives you margin to stall. And remember how I also told you that it was important that Sully had turned on the APU? Well, it turns out that if he hadn't turned on the APU, the only power that the aircraft would have been from the ram air turbine. And if that's the case, the Airbus 320 goes into alternate law. And in alternate law and subsequent direct law, the aircraft will not have the alpha floor protection that it has in normal law. The Airbus 320, if you're in normal law, which is when the computers are fully functioning, even if the pilots try to stall the aircraft will not let them, right? But if you are in alternate law or direct law, it will do what the pilots tells them. So here, as Sully is now coming closer to the water, he asks Jeff, do you have any ideas? Jeff turns back and says, no, not really. And this is also a show of great airmanship and great CRM. The fact that before you face anything like this, before you have the ultimate risk of going into the water here, you see, is there anything that we've forgotten to do? Is there anything else that we can do? You're utilizing the crew to its maximum capacity. Now, as Sully is now getting closer to the water, he tries to flare. But because of the alpha floor protection, because the speed is so low, the aircraft does not flare as much as he wanted to. He has the stick all the way back, but it still flies into the water with considerable force. The last thing that we can hear on the CVR is Sully saying, okay, let's brace. The aircraft hits the water with a force that is above the certified landing in water force. And because of that, there is some quite significant damage to the aft part of the aircraft, which is what hits the water first. The left-hand engine gets broken off, but the aircraft continues to just slow down into the water and then settles down. Because there was some quite significant damage to the aft part of the aircraft, the water entered the aircraft there and kind of sinks the aft part of the aircraft down. In the certification of the Airbus 320, it is supposed to be able to stay afloat so that you could use all of the emergency exits. Because remember, it is equipped with these slide/dinghies in both the forward and the aft emergency exit. Because it's now sinking down into the water, the cabin crew is doing an absolutely amazing work of redirecting the passengers from the aft part of the aircraft, who is now sinking down into the water, towards the overwing exits and towards the front exits. The evacuation over the overwings is going slower than normal because people are not jumping down off the wings that they would do normally. Instead, they're kind of crowding out on the wings. So some of the passengers from the aft part of the aircraft finds their way towards the forward emergency exits and exits onto the dinghies there. Fortunately, there is enough room for all 150 passengers and 5 crew in the dinghies and on the wings, and that's where you have these amazing pictures where the passengers are all crowded on the wings and in the forward part. Now, air traffic control has done a great job as well. They've been talking to the port authority in New York, who's been sending out boats. So within minutes, the boats are there picking up the passengers. Because it's freezing, most of the passengers are wet, and if they wouldn't be so close to these ferries, there is a likelihood that there would have been fatalities here. Now, the flight crew, they are unharmed. After they have settled down into the water, Sully and Jeff goes back into the cabin and actually does a sweep of the cabin to make sure that all of the crew and passengers are out before they themselves leave the aircraft through the forward emergency exits. Now, guys, I cannot overemphasize what a fantastic feat this is, all right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize this with the end of the NTSB report and what they came to when it comes to the conclusion of this accident. They say, the National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the ingestion of large birds into each engine, which resulted in an almost total loss of thrust on both engines and the subsequent ditching in the Hudson River. Contributing to the fuselage damage and resulting unavailability of the aft slide rafts were 1. The Federal Aviation Administration's approval of ditching certification without determining whether pilots could attain the ditching parameters without engine thrust. 2. The lack of industry flight crew training and guidance on ditching techniques. 3. The captain's resulting difficulty maintaining his intended airspeed on final approach due to the task saturation resulting from the emergency situation. Contributing to the survivability of the accident was 1. The decision-making of the flight crew members and their crew resource management during the accident sequence. 2. The fortuitous use of airplane that was equipped for an extended overwater flight, including the availability of forward slide/rafts, even though it was not required to be so equipped. 3. The performance of the cabin crew members while expediting the evacuation of the airplane. And 4. The proximity of emergency responders to the accident site and their immediate and appropriate response to the accident. So, with all of this in mind, the fact that they were flying that aircraft with that flight crew, that cabin crew, on a day that the weather was fine, and that they managed to land on the Hudson River close to where the boats were, and they were rescued so quickly, I think all of that together really defined why this was called the miracle on the Hudson. Now guys, as a result of this, there were more than 30 different recommendations for what needs to be done. For example, there was a recommendation that went out that pilots needed to be trained for these kind of emergencies, low altitude. The fact that there was a possibility to lose both engines soon after takeoff, and basically be trained to be able to do a ditching without engine power. It had not been part of the training program up until now, and that is not only for the Airbus fleet, it went over to us in the Boeing fleet as well. We're also doing this kind of training now because of this incident. There was also other recommendations about emergency exits, for example, about the checklist being harmonized so that, for example, the loss of thrust of both engine checklist would lead into a potential ditching checklist, which would include turning off the GPWS warnings so that you could get the low speed warnings, and many other things like this. And this is a great example on how an incident led to improvements in safety throughout the aviation business.
Cactus 1549, LaGuardia runway 4 position, hold traffic on land 31.
Position runway 4, Cactus 1549.
Cactus 1549, runway 4, cliff takeoff.
Cactus 1549, clear.
49. Cactus 1549, contact Newton, watch connect.
Good day. Cactus 1549, 700, landing 5,000.
Cactus 1549, departure to contact line, maintain 15,000.
Maintain 15,000, Cactus 1549.
Cactus 1549, turn left lane 270.
This is Cactus 1539, hit birds, so you lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures, got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines. He said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. If we can get it to you, do you want to try to land 1013?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
Showing 2760. Turn left 070.
070, showing 2760.
Hi, Cactus 1549. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Cactus 1549. Runway 4 is available if you want to make left traffic to runway 4.
I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey? Maybe Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off your right side is Teterboro Airport. You want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire, actually LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, go ahead.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge, wants to go to the airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does you need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280, you can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
Looking for the traffic, 2 Tango Alpha.
Yeah, 2 Tango Alpha, he's at 900 feet abeam the North Hudson. He's, looks like he's descending into the Hudson River. 2 Tango Alpha, it looks like there's, may be an incident here.
Roger, keeping my eyes out, 2 Tango Alpha.
2 Tango Alpha is 12 o'clock and 2.5 miles.
Got him in sight, maintaining visual.
2 Tango Alpha, roger.
Cactus 1549, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up at 2 o'clock in about 7 miles.
I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
Cactus 1529, if you can, you got runway 29 available at Newark up at 2 o'clock in 7 miles.
60.
Going down.
40. 2 Tango Alpha, course roof.
2 Tango Alpha, roger.
Hit the water.
Roger.
So that clearly showed you how important experience, continuous learning and skills are for effective short-time decision-making. But what would happen if a flight faced a similar challenge, but the pilots had a little bit more time available? In the next example, the pilots find themselves in the middle of a Category 3 hurricane, with their engines failing and no way to see where to land or ditch, until the very last minute. Now, I call this story the original Miracle on the Hudson because it happened before Sully's famous flight, and something that would become crucial to the outcome of this flight was that there were actually 3 people sitting in the cockpit, and they all worked together as a crew to solve the puzzle before them. Like in the first accident, these pilots had to pool their collective talents together by using crew resource management skills. But they also had to evaluate and change their plan quickly when they were presented with new information. Because of this, they became a great example of the applied use of my favorite decision-making model, PIOSI, although they of course didn't spell it out quite the same way. What I want you to take with you from this video is how the crew were working together and how they used intermediate time available decision-making skills to maximize the success of the outcome. The incredible story of TACA Airlines Flight 110 took place on the 24th of May 1988. The flight had originated in San Salvador, in El Salvador, and then the crew had flown over towards Belize City in Belize, and the incident happened on the second leg of the flight, the leg between Belize and New Orleans in the United States. The aircraft that they flew was a brand new Boeing 737-300 that had been delivered to TACA Airlines only a few weeks prior to the incident. On the incident flight, there were 38 passengers on board and 7 crew members. In the cockpit of the flight was Captain Carlos Dardano. He is 29 years old, but he had managed to amass an impressive 13,410 hours on the day of the accident. Together with him was First Officer Dionisio Lopez. He was also very experienced at over 12,000 hours. And there was also a third crew member, a line training captain called Arturo Sole. And the reason that he was there was not to do a line check on Carlos and Dionisio, but he was there to just verify the operation of this brand new aircraft. Because when a new aircraft variant is introduced into an existing fleet, it's very important to check how it's working and how the standard operating procedures and so on is working, right? So this makes perfect sense. Now, this was not the first day that this flight crew had flown this particular aircraft. In fact, they had been rostered to fly the exact same route the day before. But the day before, they had encountered a problem with the aircraft. When they landed after having flown from San Salvador to Belize, when they tried to start the engines again for their second flight over towards New Orleans, they just could not get the engines to start. They tried to start engine number 2, but no matter what they did, the engines would just not light up. So they shut down the aircraft, they had to cancel the flight for all the passengers, and they called in engineering. And engineering had a look at it, and what they found was that this aircraft, even though it was brand new, had been sitting out in the desert awaiting delivery for a while. And when it did so, it had drained the battery. And the battery didn't like that much, so the battery was not in good shape. So what engineering did was they just took away the old battery and replaced it with a brand new battery. And this is going to become a really, really important point in what's about to happen. The crew was really, really excited to fly this new aircraft because it had some really cool new features. It had an auto throttle, which they weren't used to using. It had nice lateral navigation, vertical navigation, and all these cool autopilot modes that they weren't used to having on the 737-200 that they normally flew. Anyway, on the incident date, the crew had prepared for the flight just like normal, and they were aware that they were flying into an area where they could encounter potential thunderstorms. But they took off normally from Belize City Airport. They climbed up to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and while they were up in cruise, the first officer asked Captain Carlos whether or not it would be possible for him to actually invite the passengers into the cockpit, just to show this eighth wonder of the world, which was the 737-300. Of course, this is back in 1988, so that was perfectly okay. They opened up the door, they let the passengers come in, take photos, look at the cockpit, and it just goes to show how proud they were, and also shows the kind of spirit of the time, which I just love. Now, before we go any further, I just want to give you a little bit of details about one of the main characters of this story, which is Captain Carlos Dardano. So, if you want to look for a real seat-of-the-pants, stick-and-rudder, proper South American pilot, Carlos would be him, okay? He'd grown up flying. He came from a flying family, so he was flying from when he was a little kid. He got his licenses as early as he possibly could. He started flying commercially at a very young age. That's why he could amass 13,000 hours at the tender age of 29. But back in 1979, so 9 years prior to this incident, he'd been in a very serious incident where he was flying a small Piper Archer out close to San Salvador. After landing, he'd been caught in crossfires between the guerrilla and the normal El Salvador army, and a sniper had actually shot him. The bullet entered in the back of his cheek and went out through his left eye, leaving him completely blind on his left eye. Now you might ask yourself, how is that then possible that he is allowed to fly commercially with only one eye? And it wasn't easy, right? He had to go out and do what we call functional test flights. Because he was already flying commercially, they didn't want to take his livelihood away from him. So he had got the chance to go out and prove that he could still fly perfectly with only one eye. And after a period of about 3 months, they had actually allowed him to maintain his Class 1 medical, not only in El Salvador, which he was originally from, but also in the United States, because he was based in New Orleans at the time, so he needed the FAA to approve it as well. And they did, right? So he was flying on a special type of medical license at the time of the incident. Anyway, as the crew were now getting closer to their top of descent, they got the passengers out of the cockpit, they started to brief for the approach in towards New Orleans, and they also started seeing these thunderstorms appearing on the weather radar. Okay? Now, the weather radar on the 737-300 was state-of-the-art, really good weather radar. And the way a weather radar works generally is that you have a radar antenna that's situated in the nose cone, as in the very front of the aircraft, and that radar antenna will send out radar pulses. Okay? And the way it works is that the radar pulses will then bounce off things like precipitation, so rain, hail, snow, and the weather radar measures how much radar pulses is coming back in and how long it took for them to return. And based on that, it can form a picture of how much precipitation you have ahead of you and also how far away it is. And it shows that on our navigation displays. Okay? On the navigation display, you'll see a picture that's very similar to what you see when you watch the weather at the news on TV. So very light rain would be depicted as green. You get a little bit more rain or precipitation, it turns amber. And then the really bad, heavy precipitation is red. Okay? Areas that are clear from any type of precipitation is generally black. So the aircraft now started to descend. It left 35,000 feet, and at about 30,000 feet, they went into a covering cloud layer. Just prior to entering the clouds, they did what we always tend to do. They put the engine start switches to continuous. This means that instead of what we normally have during cruise, the start switches to off, which is when the kind of flame inside of the combustion chambers in the jet engines are just feeding itself. Well then, just out of an abundance of caution, we switch it to continuous, which means that the igniter inside of the jet engine continuously keeps igniting. That's to make sure, or safeguard against flame out as we get into potential icing conditions. So that's what they did. They put the start switches to continuous, and they switched on the engine anti-ice for the same reason. But now, as they're descending in towards New Orleans, they see that there are at least 2 big thunderstorms ahead of them, right? They see these 2 red cells. So they get in contact with Houston Air Traffic Control, and they ask them to divert towards the east to get around these thunderstorms. Houston Air Traffic Control gives them the clearance to do so. Basically, they say you can deviate on your own kind of reconnaissance and just tell us when you're turning back towards New Orleans. So that's what they did. They're looking at these thunderstorms, and they see that in between the thunderstorms, there looks like there is a black area that they could safely navigate through and get back in towards New Orleans. Another thing that you have to understand about weather radars is that they're not perfect, okay? And just like with any type of obstacle, if you have a really heavy thunderstorm in front of you, well then a lot of these radar pulses that are being emitted is going to come back into the radar. That's what's giving you the kind of red radar return. But another function of that is that you will be unable to see what's behind this red cell. That's what we call a radar shadow, all right? And that happens behind mountains, for example, behind large buildings, or in this case, behind really severe thunderstorms. So this means that if you have, like they had in this case, 2 big thunderstorm cells and then an area of black that is in between and behind it, it might give you a false sense of security. But the only reason that you don't see anything behind these radar echoes is just because something called attenuation, all right? It's the weakening of the radar signal. So the crew now turns in between these 2 cells, and as soon as they get in between them, they realize their mistake. Okay, turns out that behind these 2 initial cells, there's a much bigger red cell, and now they're completely surrounded. They have cells both on the left and the right, and they fly into this thunderstorm. As they do so, they almost immediately encounter moderate to severe turbulence. The turbulence is so bad that they reported that they could not see the instruments ahead of them. They had problems reading their instruments. Seconds later, they enter into some really heavy hail. Okay, 30 seconds of severe hail and heavy rain. It's expected that the rain was equivalent to about 30 inches per hour, or about 25 to 30 grams of water per square meter, just to give you some idea of how much water it is. And as they're entering this hailstorm now, both engines flame out. Now, you might ask yourself at this point, engines flaming out, how come they flame out? Aren't they tested to be able to ingest a lot of water? And you'd be absolutely right to ask that question. In fact, the engines, the CFM56 engines that were fitted to the 737-300 has been certified to take almost 4 times the amount of water that was expected that the engines were ingesting at the time and still continue to operate. However, turns out that there has been a crucial omission when it comes to the testing and certification of these engines. Because the engineers that made this test, they assumed that water and hail would act in kind of the same way, right? So they never tested how this jet engine would actually perform if there was hail involved. And it turns out that while they were using basically fire hoses and shot straight into the engine during the testing and certification, the water would hit the fan blades and be centrifugated out towards the bypass duct and away from the core of the engine. But the hail didn't work that way. Instead, the hail worked more like a bullet. It followed a ballistic path. So while the water was centrifugated out, these hail pellets, they went in, and especially turns out at lower power settings, when the fan is not rotating at such a high speed, it could go in between the fan blades and enter straight into the compressor stage of the engine, and then basically saturate that stage into the combustion chamber and flame the engine out. So this is what happened on this flight, and it happened on both engines simultaneously. And when this happened, you have to understand that generally the aircraft takes all of its electric power from the two engine-driven generators, which is connected to the engines. So they're now in heavy, severe turbulence. Both engine flames out. This means that the cockpit essentially goes black, except for the multitude of warnings, master course warnings, that they are getting. The primary instrumentation in front of the pilot also disappear. And here is where I want you to pay close attention, because what Captain Carlos is doing now is something that we, all pilots, should learn from. He continues to fly the aircraft. Even though he is originally very, very disoriented, this heavy turbulence will very quickly, make you lose sight of what's up and down, especially as you don't have any visual references. He looks around this cockpit to see what he can trust. And on the 737-300, when it loses electrical power from the generator, it goes to its backup source, which is battery. Remember the battery that they had just changed the day before? The battery is built to drive some of the more critical systems. Okay, that means that they have the standby instruments, you have one radio, you have a few warnings that are still working, you have some emergency lighting for the cabin, and a few other systems. Okay. The 737 does not have a ram air turbine, because you still can fly the aircraft, as in the flight controls are connected by wires to its respective rudder surface. So you can use only battery power, and the battery fitted onto the 737-300 will last for about 30 minutes. So Captain Carlos is looking over, he sees his tiny little standby horizon, and he uses that, fixates on that, make sure that the aircraft keeps flying wings level and on speed. Right? That's all he's doing at this point. And this goes to the crucial aviate, navigate, communicate that we always have to follow when we're flying aircraft. Right? And it's likely that if he would have been overcome by the turbulence, by the loss of both engines, at this point he could have ended up in a very bad attitude from which he potentially couldn't escape later on. But he continues to fly, and that's the important bit. Now, as he's doing this, he's now calling over to his colleagues and he's telling, I've lost trust on both engines. Initially, they don't even believe him, right? They think that he's joking, but he shows them by putting the thrust levels forward twice without getting any kind of response. So he tells them, try to fix it. Try to get one of the engines running. But at this point, the industry didn't think that it was possible for two engines to flame out at the same time, which meant that up until this point, there was no loss of thrust on both engines checklist. Okay, so the first officer, together with the training captain on the jump seat, now had to try to start the engines from their basic knowledge of the aircraft and from the existing engine failure checklist. So they went about trying to do this. Okay, Captain Carlos concentrated on flying the aircraft. His two colleagues are now trying to start the engines, and initially they tried to start it with something called a windmilling start. That's basically when you're using the speed of the aircraft, the air that is being pushed in by the speed of the aircraft, to rotate the engine part, both the fan and the compressors, to get the engine started. But it turns out it just doesn't work. Right? There's just too much water inside of the engine. It's possible that the speed wasn't high enough. Generally, you need more than 300 knots in order to be able to do this. So they realized they need something else, right? They need the auxiliary power units, the APU, the little engine that's in the back of the aircraft. So this is happening at about 16,000 feet, and as they descend through about 12,000 feet, they reach over and they start the APU. The APU starts up. When they have that up and running, it means that they now get full electrical power restored, so they get their primary instrumentations back, they get their radios back. So at this point, they also have a possibility to call air traffic control with a mayday call, telling them that they have lost all power. Air traffic control is extremely helpful. Okay, they start to give potential vectors towards a landable spot. That includes several lakes in the area. It includes an interstate highway as an airfield that's a little bit closer than New Orleans International Airport. But Captain Carlos quickly realizes that with the kind of turbulence, just remember they're still inside of the thunderstorm here, they're losing altitude very quickly and they won't be able to reach any of those. His colleagues are now working to try to use the APU to start the engines up, and they manage to get both engine number 1 and engine number 2 started up as in the EGT started to rise. The problem though is it turns out that the engines are too saturated with water. So even though they have the engines lighting up, they cannot get them to function properly. Instead, as Captain Carlos is now asking the engines for thrust, what happens is that the engines immediately overheat, right? The exhaust gas temperature becomes too high and it actually melts some parts of the turbines in the engines, causing damage to the engines. He gets overheat warning. I think that they also got a fire warning shortly, so they realized that, okay, these engines are not working and they shut them down. So now they know, right? They are not going to have any engines. They are going to continue to fly this aircraft and land it wherever they can. Captain Carlos has now called the cabin crew as well. They told them to prepare for a potential ditching, definitely for an emergency landing. So the cabin crew is preparing the passengers for this. As the aircraft is now descending out through about 5,000 feet, the crew starts to see the ground below them. And in an interview, which by the way I've linked to up here, you have to watch this interview if you're interested in getting more details about this incident. Captain Carlos says that he could kind of see this perfectly runway-shaped canal that is on the eastern outskirts of New Orleans. He realized that it's at 5,000 feet, it's about 15 miles away, which is perfect gliding distance from the 737, and he lines the aircraft up to ditch in this canal. Right. So, as they're descending down now, the first officer is running through the ditching checklist. Okay? The ditching checklist includes things like, for example, closing the outflow valve, preparing the cabin crew, pulling certain circuit breakers and deactivating the GPWS warning, things like that. As the aircraft is coming in and lining up for the ditching, the first officer is looking out on his side and he realized that on the side of the canal there is something called a levee. All right, there's basically a grass-covered area, not as wide as the canal, but wide enough to land on with just a slight inclination. Okay, so the first officer pointed out to the captain and said, "Captain, we can land over there." Captain Carlos looks out, realizes that that is a good landing spot, but also realizes that he is a little bit high. So while he had prepared for the ditching, he had prepared to go in without much flaps and with the gear up, because that's how you would go into a ditching. He now asks immediately to take the gear down, okay? To get the flaps out, he reaches for his speed brakes, pull the speed brake out, and he also does something that you just don't hear people do on commercial airliners. He does what we call a side slip, right? That is when you push rudder and opposite aileron in order to essentially push the aircraft body into the airstream and make the whole body work as an air brake. This is a very efficient way to lose altitude, something that you would use on smaller aircraft or on gliders to get down, but not on airliners. Because if you do that, you can actually induce an engine failure on one side because of the vortexes that comes off the body and into the engine. But of course, these guys, they don't have any engine, so that's not really a risk that he's taking. So he slide slips into position. He sees that on the very kind of near end of this levee there is a fence, so he just eases over that fence comes in and makes a perfect, smooth butter landing on this leeway. Okay. Remember, they don't have any thrust reversers, so he has to use brakes. He cannot use too much brakes because he doesn't know how soft the ground is, but he managed to roll out and bring the aircraft to a complete stop. The aircraft is safe. The passengers are safe, and there's not even any damage except for the damage that's already been caused to the engines. This is an amazing story. Okay, they sit for a while, look at each other, give each other a hug, and then realize that we should probably evacuate. There actually was a discussion in the cockpit whether or not they should evacuate because the aircraft is safe, but then again, you don't really know if, for example, the landing gear is safe or not. So they decide to evacuate the aircraft, they call for the evacuation, everyone gets off the aircraft, and then the thunderstorm that they just flown through comes in and it starts raining heavily outside. Now outside, everyone is calling for the pilots to come out. Come out, jump out. And Captain Carlos and his flight crew just looks at them and said, no, it's raining. So they actually sit inside of the aircraft until it stops raining. And then they go out and join the passengers outside. After landing, the representatives of TACA Airlines had a bit of a quandary. Like, how are they going to get this aircraft away from this levee? Initially, they thought that the best way to do it was probably to just demount the wings and put the whole aircraft on a barge together with the wings and then get it to a place where it could be reassembled and reused again. But then someone pointed out that the levee that they had landed on was next to the NASA Mashud assembly facility, which used to, during World War II, be an assembly factory for making, among other things, aircraft. And when you have an assembly line for aircraft, it's handy if you have an airport as well. So it turns out that the road that was just in front of this NASA facility used to be an old World War II runway that had now been turned into something called the Saturn Boulevard. So what they did instead was they waited until the ground had dried up a little bit so it could kind of support the wheels of the aircraft, and then they towed the aircraft to the beginning of this road. Then they got FAA clearance. FAA went out, made sure that obstacle clearance and so was okay. Then they loaded up the aircraft with the minimum amount of fuel needed, and then a couple of test pilots, not the same crew as did the flight, used this road and took off. Right? They took off from this piece of road and then flew over to land at New Orleans airport, which is where they were supposed to go, only 13 days late. So that's how they solved this. This aircraft was in such good shape after this landing that the only thing they needed to do was change the engines, basically, that had been damaged during the hailstorm. And once they had the engines on, the aircraft was completely airworthy. So they could do this flight, which is amazing. Anyway, obviously there were some upgrades needed to the CFM56 engines. After this incident, CFM went in and they looked very, very closely onto the certification requirements, and they realized that they needed to, for one thing, upgrade the spinner. The spinner before this incident was conical, and then what they did was they shaped it into a mix between a conical and an elliptical shape. So it's now called a conelliptical shape instead. That's the kind of spinners that you see on modern 737s. The reason they wanted to do that was because they found out that if hail hits that shape, it will deflect the hail outwards and thus protecting the core of the engine inside. They also changed a little bit the distance and the number of fan blades on the engine, and they incorporated more variable bleed valve doors inside of the core of the engine, so that during low RPMs, during low power settings, these bleed valve doors could open and let any water that had been ingested into the core out before it reached into the combustion chamber. So there was some major upgrades made to the engine in itself. But on top of that, there was also some operational guidance given to the pilots. So for a while, if the pilots realized that they were going to go through moderate to heavy precipitation, they couldn't bring the engine back to idle. They had to stay at a slightly higher power setting to avoid this from happening. So once again, guys, as you can see, this is a very serious incident, this time handled masterfully by the crew. They helped each other out, they worked CRM, they flew the aircraft, which is really, really important. And after that, the authorities went in and saw what can we improve, how can we make flying safer, and it then became safer after it. I really love that story, and I'm actually still in contact with Captain Carlos, who have recently retired from active airline duty. He and his crew will always be remembered in the history books as some of aviation's biggest heroes. The next story I have for you will be focusing on resilience, meaning the ability to successfully adapt to situations that you might not have been specifically trained for using your existing knowledge, training and skills. In this story, the crew went from a completely routine flight into a nightmarish scenario that no one had even thought about training for. And I want you to pay particular attention to the coolness of the first officer and the incredible use of the whole crew. It's a grey Sunday morning in the United Kingdom. A BAC 111 aircraft from British Airways is on their initial departure from Birmingham International Airport on their way down towards sunny Malaga in Spain. The cabin crew is getting ready for their breakfast service, and in the cockpit the captain and the first officer is relaxing a little bit and they're starting to loosen up their seat belts. Suddenly a bang is heard and the entire cabin is filled with dense condensation fog. The cockpit door is violently thrown into the cockpit, and when the cabin crew looks through the debris inside of the cockpit, to their horror they realize that the captain has been sucked halfway out from the aircraft through a hole where the forward left windshield used to be. What happens next is an incredible story, and it is the story of British Airways Flight 5390. Stay tuned. British Airways Flight 5390 took off on the 10th of June 1990. There were 81 passengers on board, 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots, and the aircraft that was being flown was a 19-year-old BAC 111. Now the BAC 111 looks a little bit like a DC-9er. It's a short to medium haul aircraft with 2 rear-mounted low bypass jet engines, and it was known as a very reliable workhorse of the sky. Now this particular aircraft that was used on this day had been on the ground for about 27 hours prior to this flight because it had to undergo some mandatory maintenance. The previous crew had reported that they had seen some darkening and some bubbles on the left-hand windscreen just ahead of the captain, and that needed to be changed. And the maintenance work that took place on this aircraft prior to departure is going to be really important, but we'll get to that in a second. In the cockpit was Captain Timothy Lancaster. He's 42 years old. He has got about 11,050 hours of total time, of which 1,075 is on the BAC 111. Together with him was First Officer Alistair Atkinson. He is also quite experienced, 7,500 hours in total, of which 1,100 hours on the BAC 111. Now the day started just like any other normal Sunday flight. The weather outside was grey, but good visibility, light winds, and the crew was reported to be really happy about doing this flight, because generally these weekend kind of holiday destination flights tend to bring really happy and relaxed passengers, so the crew was looking forward to a nice and easy day at work. They also knew each other really well. They were a tightly knit gang, and the only one that was really new to the crew was First Officer Alistair. The flight crew had prepared for the flight just as normal. There was no bad weather expected. First Officer Alistair was the one who was going to be pilot flying for the departure. And then, according to British Airways standard operating procedures at the time, Timothy, the captain, would take over after the initial takeoff, and then he would be pilot flying for the remainder of the flight. So said and done, the aircraft pushed back, and at time 07:20 UTC, the aircraft took off towards Malaga. Now, if you take off from Birmingham, and I've done this many times, you have to go through London airspace, which is one of the most busy airspaces in the world. And this means that you can expect to get a lot of different radar headings and a lot of different altitude clearances as you climb out. And this is exactly what happened to British Airways Flight 5390 as well. Initially, they were cleared on a southerly vector, heading of 195 degrees to maintain, and they climbed up to flight level 140, 14,000 feet. They remained there for a while, and then eventually they got cleared into a different air traffic control sector. Once they changed over to that sector, they were cleared to flight level 230, 23,000 feet. And they were expecting eventually to get up to their initial cruising altitude of 25,000 feet. Now, as the crew had completed their initial departure procedures, they started to relax a little bit. And it's important for you to understand how we, the pilots, use the seatbelts when we're in the cockpit. So generally, most airlines will require us to be completely strapped in with a full seatbelt on from takeoff up to about 10,000 feet, and then from 10,000 feet down to landing. But between there, we can kind of relax the seats a little bit. We tend to have a full harness, which consists of a seatbelt around our waist and then across the crotch, and then two kind of shoulder harnesses over this. But the shoulder harnesses are not really comfortable to wear, long term. So that tends to be the first thing that we remove. And the way that we do that is that there is a button at the back of the seatbelt buckle. When you push that, the only thing that happens is that the seatbelt shoulder harness releases, but the rest of the seatbelt stays intact. And this is exactly what the crew of British Airways 5390 did as well. So they released the shoulder harnesses, and Captain Tim kind of loosened up the waist seatbelt a little bit as well in order to make it more comfortable. The aircraft now continued to climb, and as they were doing so, the cabin crew was getting ready for the first meal service of the day, which is going to be breakfast for the passengers. But as the aircraft climbed through about 17,300 feet, a large bang could be heard from inside of the cockpit. Almost immediately, the entire cabin filled with dense condensation fog, and the cockpit door was violently flung into the cockpit, where it jammed itself behind the thrust levers. Now, when everyone had regained their bearings after the initial shock, the number 3 cabin crew looked in through the debris inside of the cockpit and realized, to his horror, that the upper body of the captain was sucked out through the left-hand windshield, and the only thing that was still inside of the cockpit was his leg that had gotten tangled in the flight controls. So the number 3, without hesitation, ran in and started to hold the captain around his waist to stop him from sliding more out through the window. But he reported that the upper body, the back of the captain, was kind of flush up against the body of the aircraft, and his head was banging towards the left DV window. As the captain was sucked out through the window, his feet had actually pushed the flight controls, and as they did that, they disconnected the autopilot. So this means that the first officer was now faced with a situation where he had an explosive decompression. He had his colleague being partially sucked out through the window, which you could see. There would have been an enormous inflow of really cold air and noise in the cabin. Loads of debris had been thrown into the cockpit because of the loss of the window. So this is a very, very serious situation right now. And the first officer realized very quickly that the first thing he needed to do was to get the aircraft down, because the BAC 111 did not have automatic masks for the passengers. That wasn't a requirement when the BAC 111 was certified. Instead, there was passenger oxygen that could be given to about 18 passengers on demand. But this meant that he now needed to get the aircraft down quickly. Now, he had the choice at this point to put his own oxygen mask on as well, but he realized that they were at 17,300 feet when this happened. Because the autopilot had been disconnected and the captain had kicked the flight controls, the aircraft had already initiated a fairly rapid descent. So he didn't think there was any need for him to put his own oxygen mask on, because he realized that if he did, he would have huge problems communicating with both air traffic control, but also with the cabin crew, who was now in holding on to the captain for dear life. So the first officer is now flying the aircraft. He's maintaining his heading of 195 degrees. He's initiated his descent, and he now calls a mayday call to air traffic control. Because of the enormous noise inside of the cockpit, air traffic control could hear him call mayday, but when they responded, he couldn't hear them properly. So it took a few minutes to establish the nature of the problem with air traffic control, and even when air traffic control realized that they were dealing with a serious emergency, they kept taking on other traffic onto the frequency as well. And this was going to be something that the investigation was going to hone in on later on, but we'll talk about that later. As the aircraft is now descending down towards 10,000 feet, the number 3, his name is Nigel Ogden, who's holding on to the captain, is starting to lose his grip. And that's partially because of the slipstream pulling on the captain, wanting to pull him further out, but also because Nigel is in the direct stream of air. And the temperature outside, as the maneuver initiated, was about minus 17 degrees Celsius. Now, with the speed of the aircraft and the rush of the air, the wind chill factor with that kind of temperature would probably been around minus 42 degrees Celsius or minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's extremely cold, and he's getting frostbite, both on his arms but also onto his left eye. The rest of the cabin crew is seeing this happening. The purser has already gone in and started to collect the parts of the broken door. He's taking care of that, putting it inside of the front left toilet. But as he's seeing this happening, both the purser and the number 2 cabin crew comes in to try to relieve Nigel from holding the captain. The purser kind of rips his arm around the seat belts on the jump seat, which is behind the captain's chair, and holds the captain as Nigel gets out of the way. And then the number 2 cabin crew comes in, sits down and grabs hold of the ankles of the captain. And he's going to be staying inside of the cockpit for the remainder of the flight. As the aircraft is now descending down, the first officer is asking for as much support as he can possibly get from air traffic control. And he's asking initially to get radar vectors toward Gatwick Airport, because this is an airport that he knows really well. Air traffic control is accommodating his requests. They say that they can give him vectors towards Gatwick, but they also tell him that he has Southampton Airport really close by, and he can choose which one of these airports he wants to go to. First Officer Alistair is a little bit hesitant at first, but then realizes that he really wants to get down on the ground as soon as he can. So he asks for vectors towards Southampton Airport. But he also says that he needs about 2,500 meters of runway. Southampton Airport is only about 1,700 meters. Air traffic control relays this information to the first officer. The first officer is a little bit hesitant at first because he recognizes that, they just took off from Birmingham. They have a lot of fuel on board. They're probably quite heavy. But after some quick calculations, says that he can accept 1,700 meters and Southampton, and he starts getting vectors into that. The problem in Southampton is that they don't have any instrument landing system. They only have a VOR. So he asks to get vectored for a visual approach in towards Southampton. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective here, the first officer is now faced with a situation where he is dealing with a serious emergency to his aircraft. He doesn't have his colleague helping him out. He is not able to use his cabin crew to help him out with reading checklists and so on, because they are holding on to the captain. So this is now all up to him, and he has to do a visual approach into an airport to which he's not very familiar. So this is going to cause a lot of stress on the first officer. But even though he's under this pressure, he still managed to safely set the aircraft up, configure it for landing, and he even remembers to switch on the auxiliary power unit, the APU, so that he has electrical power when he gets down on the runway, because he realizes that he's going to have to shut the engines down to get the passengers off, and unless the APU is running, it's going to be delayed. This is an amazing show of cool airmanship and situational awareness on behalf of the first officer, and this is something that he's going to receive prizes for after this is over. So what's happening to the captain then? Well, the crew report after the incident that they were completely convinced that he had died. All right, you can even hear on the transcripts from the air traffic control interaction with the first officer that he reports that the captain has been sucked out through the window. I think he's dead. So as the aircraft is descending down to around 3,000 feet, they are really surprised to see that the legs of the captain is starting to kick. Now the captain, after the incident, actually describes that as he got sucked out, he was initially conscious, right? He was surprised that he was able to breathe. Eventually he lost consciousness, but that he regained it later on. So as the aircraft now comes in and does a picture-perfect visual approach into runway 02 in Southampton, the aircraft comes to a stop on the runway. The passengers are disembarked during the normal exits, and then the firefighter comes in and helps the captain out from the position. He's still hanging outside of the window of the aircraft. They get him onto an ambulance, obviously, and it turns out that apart from frostbite, a broken thumb and a fractured arm, he is perfectly okay. The only other person that received any kind of injuries on this flight was the cabin crew, Nigel Ogden, who, while he was holding the captain, had some frostbite damage to one of his eyes and a dislocated shoulder. But all of the passengers managed to get out safely, and eventually the captain recovered, and he actually returned to service only about 5 months after this harrowing incident. But what actually caused this? How come that the windshield would just suddenly disattach itself and fly away mid-air? As the investigation started into British Airways Flight 5390, they started looking back into the maintenance records of this BAC 111. And they realized that 27 hours before the departure, during the night shift, the maintenance crew that had been working on the aircraft had seen that there was a need to replace the captain's side windshield. Now they were a little bit short of people, so the maintenance manager himself had decided to do the job. And he had gone to the aircraft that was in the hangar at that time. It was raining outside, and he'd set up a working station in order to do this. The problem was that it was a little bit tight, so he couldn't really get the workstation into the right place. This meant that he had to work with himself on top of the scaffolding, kind of hanging over the nose of the aircraft to kind of reach all of the bolts that was needed to fasten the windshield. Now the windshield on a BAC 111 is not fitted like most other aircraft from the inside and out. That would have given it a kind of plug type, which meant that as the pressure inside of the aircraft builds up, the pressure would hold the windshield in place. Instead, the BAC 111 has a windshield that is mounted from the outside and in, and because of that, it needed a quite large amount of screws to hold it in place. In fact, it was 90 different screws needed. And as the windshield was dismounted, the engineers found that a lot of the screws were damaged because of the way that they dismounted them, so they needed replacing them. But when they went to get new screws, they didn't look at the maintenance description on how to actually do this procedure. Instead, they just took the screws that they had used before and they went over to their storage to get more of these screws. It turned out that the person that was working in the storage at the time only had 4 of these particular screws. So the manager just went down into kind of the basement where it was very poorly lit and looked to find similar screws. But instead of looking at the description, as in the type of screw that he was using, he held these screws up next to each other and until he found some screws that he thought looked identical. The issue was that when he used these screws had the same kind of thread size as the original screws, but they were about 0.66 millimeters thinner, as in less diameter. So this meant that as the screws were actually entered into the holes, it felt like they were actually attached, but because they were thinner, they didn't actually attach to the holes the way that it should be doing. He would have noticed this if he would have been in a position where he could view these heads of the screws because they were countersunk, and the size of the screw heads were much smaller on these screws than they were on the proper screws, which meant that if you would have compared the left windshield with the right windshield, you would have seen that the screws on the right windshield actually covered the kind of countersink almost entirely, but the screws that he was using was going well inside of the hole. But he didn't notice that, partially because of the way that he was working over the kind of top of the nose of the aircraft, but also because he was using some incorrect tooling to actually fit the screws into the holes, which didn't allow him to feel that the amount of torque that was necessary to fix the screws was incorrect. Now, on top of this, because the engineer who actually did this change of the windshield was also the shift manager, it meant that he was also responsible for verifying the quality of any work that had been done during his shift. So this meant that there was no other engineer who could come there and verify that the job had been properly done. Now, there were rules at the time. If maintenance was done on certain points of the aircraft that was deemed to be vital points, then another engineer had to come by and check it out. But the windshield was not considered a vital point, funnily enough, which meant that there was no one there to check this. So the first time that the quality of this maintenance job actually was tested was on a flight where the passengers were on board and the windshield started being subjected to the pressurization of the aircraft. Now we all know now what happened. As the aircraft passed 17,300 feet, the differential pressure between the inside of the aircraft and the outside of the aircraft became so big that these faulty screws that weren't wide enough just could not hold the pressure, and the entire windscreen just popped up. The windscreen was recovered later on the field with some of these screws still attached to it, and that's how they could verify that the incorrect screws had been used. The shift manager had one last chance to pick up this mistake before the aircraft got airborne, because since the aircraft was actually sitting on the ground for 27 hours before the flight, he was working on a different aircraft on the following day, which also needed a replacement of the windshield. But in that occasion, the job was kind of set up for him. So when he arrived to replace the windshield, he had not only the new windshield, but also the 90 screws that was needed for the job. And he recognized that the screws that was used on that job was different than the ones that he had used the previous day. But he basically just thought that, well, maybe they're different models, and he didn't think much more of it. But there was probably the best kind of point to pick up this mistake. Now, the investigation team came to a couple of different conclusions based on this. There were basically three causal factors. The first one was that an individual, in this case a shift manager, was responsible to do the job and to sign off that the job had been correctly done, because this was not considered a vital part. So there was no cross-checking being done. The second point was that this shift maintenance manager's ability and potential to do this maintenance job correctly was severely eroded by his lack of professional attitude, of adherence to the standard operating procedures that were available, and his use of incorrect tooling. So this was kind of seen as being the main factor in here. And the third point was that British Airways had not been able to, through their quality systems and their reporting system, find out that these kind of faulty work practices had crept in to stop this from happening in the first place. That's some quite damaging feedback coming from the investigation team. And when I read this report, I couldn't help but feel sorry for the engineer, because from all I could read, he was an exemplary employee by British Airways. He'd done an absolutely fantastic job up until that point. He seemed to really care about the quality of his job, the quality of his colleagues and its teams, but it's just been one of those cases where inadequate procedures and care for procedures had kind of crept in over long term. And the fact is that engineers were not giving recurrent training at the time. So once you had your engineering job and your engineering license, you could just continue to work. And whenever inadequate kind of procedures and ways to work creeps in, there was no way really to catch it. There were 8 different recommendations that came out of this accident investigation. The most important ones were that there needed to be a review of the system where one engineer could be both doing an engineering task and self-certifying that it had been properly done, even though it was not considered a vital point. Okay, so that system needed to be reviewed. There also needed to be a better, more efficient quality assurance program outlined, where people that was actually working, like the engineers in this case, could clearly and easily outline faults and problems with procedures and so on, and that could be brought to the attention of the company. There was also a recommendation saying that recurrent training should be introduced to engineers, so that if some kind of bad work practices or non-adherence to procedures started to creep in over time, well then the recurrent training could kind of catch that and push the people in towards the right way of doing things, much like the way that we do it with pilots nowadays. There was also a recommendation that air traffic controllers needed to get a formalized both theoretical and practical course on how to deal with emergencies before they were certified. I'm guessing that they were still trained on this before this accident, but that the investigation team thought that it was inadequate and that there needed to be some kind of improvement on this training system. So as you can see, guys, just like with every single one of these videos I do about incidents and accidents, the industry is learning from what's happening, right? We see what is happening, we investigate it, and then we apply procedures to make sure that these kind of emergencies shouldn't happen again. This is how we work as an industry, and that's what I'm hoping that you're taking away from these videos as well. That story always warms my heart, and it also shows how important it is to be able to take a deep breath, calm yourself down and fall back onto trained procedures when faced by a really severe crisis. My last story in this compilation is about bringing together everything that we've seen so far: skills, training, experience, system knowledge, CRM and resilience. This crew needed every ounce of these resources to keep this aircraft together, as it was literally trying to shake itself apart, and they then had to land it knowing full well that they would only have one shot at doing so. These pilots were faced with a situation that their procedures were supposed to cover, but ultimately didn't. And here I want to once again show how important teamwork can be. And I want to also submit this as evidence exhibit A for not removing any more pilots from the cockpit. The 13th of February 2018 was a beautiful day in San Francisco on the west coast of the United States. The visibility was well over 10 miles, hardly any clouds and only light winds, a perfect day for flying in other words. This was exactly what Captain Christopher Benham thought as he was heading out towards San Francisco Airport in the morning. He was a tall, distinguished 57-year-old captain with proud Iranian heritage who had, just like me, dreamed about becoming an airline pilot ever since he was a little boy. Through hard work and dedication, he had then managed to achieve this goal and worked his way up through the United Airlines organization to the point where he was finally a commander and a check airman on the mighty Boeing 777. At the time of this flight, he had amassed just over 13,600 hours of total time and had, during his career, flown almost all of the large Boeings, including the 737, 747, 757, 767, and now the Boeing 777, which he was actually reasonably new on at this point, with only 360 hours flown on it. He was in a particularly good mood this morning, since he was flying over to Honolulu, Hawaii, which was one of his absolute favorite destinations, and a route that he'd flown loads of times over his career and was therefore very comfortable with. As he entered the crew room, he soon met up with his colleague, First Officer Paul Ayer, which he had actually never flown with before this flight. Paul was 60 years old and also very experienced. He had just over 11,300 hours in total, of which around 10,000 had been flown on the 777. But this was only going to be his second flight from San Francisco to Honolulu, since he was normally based in Washington, D.C. The two pilots found it really easy to talk to each other, and they soon started looking through their pre-flight briefing material, and the weather looked great for the entire flight, with only some cloudy weather expected over Honolulu at the end of the flight, but everything was well within planning requirements. When the pre-flight check was completed, they ordered the fuel and then they walked over to the cabin crew to brief them about the flight. The flight time was expected to be around 4 hours and 40 minutes, with only some occasional turbulence and with 364 passengers planned. Once everyone had asked their questions and were ready, the whole crew then walked together out to the gate where their shiny 777 was waiting for them. It was an amazing looking machine, which had been bought new by United 23 years earlier and was now basking in the sunlight with all sorts of catering and fueling going on around it. Now, the Boeing 777 is an absolutely amazing aircraft, and if you've ever had a chance to look at one up close, there's one thing that I guarantee you will stand out. It's two gigantic engines. These engines are going to play a very central role in this story, so before we continue, I want to explain a little bit more about them. The Pratt & Whitney 4077 engines have a fan diameter of 112 inches or 2.8 meters, meaning that the outer diameter of the fan cowling is almost as wide as the body of the Boeing 737 that I fly. These enormous engines are a big reason why the airliner has become as popular as it is, because generally the larger the engine fan diameter is, the more efficient the whole engine is. And why is that then? Well, what drives an aircraft forward is essentially the reaction force created by sucking air in through the front of the engines and then accelerating it backwards. If we want to increase that force, we either have to accelerate the same amount of air a lot or accelerate a larger amount of air a little bit. As jet engine technology has become more mature, it has become clear that the second option is way more fuel efficient, so that's why we constantly see bigger and bigger engines being created, as the bigger fans will increase the bypass ratio, meaning the amount of air that flows past the engine core and therefore the total air mass accelerated. But making engines bigger also has some drawbacks. As the engines get bigger, so does all of the involved components, which means a significantly higher weight. And at a certain point, that weight increase will outweigh the performance increase by the bigger fan, meaning that the engine has then reached its maximum size. In order to counteract this, the engine manufacturers are always working on new designs that will allow the components to become lighter and therefore enable the engines to become even bigger. In the case of the PW4000 series engines, one of the strategies used to achieve this was to hollow out the titanium alloy fan blades and therefore create empty chambers inside of them. Obviously, this reduced the weight substantially in the 101 centimeters long individual fan blades, but it also introduced a problem. Since these blades would be subjected to incredible forces during their lifespans, there needed to be a way to inspect them on regular intervals to make sure that there were no fatigue cracks appearing. Now, if the blade is solid, this is relatively easy. But if there are hollow chambers within them, it becomes substantially more complicated to do. Pratt & Whitney obviously were aware of this and had been working on different ways of doing these inspections since the engines were introduced back in 1984. Initially, they used ultrasound and X-ray technology, but in 2005 they came up with a new solution called thermal acoustic imaging, or TAI. The way that worked was by using sound energy to create vibrations inside the fan blade material, and if there was a crack present, the surfaces inside of that crack would then start rubbing up against each other, creating a heat signal which could be detected using a thermal sensor. This was a brilliant idea and relatively simple compared to other techniques, so Pratt & Whitney quickly rolled it out wide, and after that, only if there was a positive indication of the TAI would the blade be sent for further non-destructive testing using other technologies. But since TAI was considered a new and emerging technology, there initially were no defined training and certification regimen for the inspectors who were going to use it. And there were a lot of fan blades who needed to be inspected. The blades who were fitted to the aircraft in this story had gone through TAI inspections in both 2010 and 2015, and the inspectors had noticed something looking a bit odd on one of the blades, but had written it off as an issue with the overlaying paint layer on that blade. Now you might ask, what's the point of this check if discrepancies are written off without further investigations? And that's a valid point, but it all becomes a little bit more clear when you think back of that lack of training that I mentioned earlier. You see, on similar inspections using other technologies, the required minimum training was 40 classroom hours followed by 1,200 hours of practical training. But the inspectors who was handling the inspections of these involved fan blades had only received a total of 40 hours of practical training. That's it. There had been more training offered, but unfortunately the involved inspector had not been able to attend that training since he was working through a huge inspection backlog at the time. And there were also other factors, like the fact that the inspections were taking place in a room where a lot of sunshine regularly came in, which could create ghost images on the thermal scans, making the evaluations even harder to interpret. And together, all of these factors had allowed a fan blade, number 11 on this number 2 engine on the aircraft, to develop a tiny little crack inside the hollow space near the root of the blade. This crack was completely impossible to see with the naked eye, but kept growing bigger and bigger for each cycle that the engine operated. Anyway, when the pilots had left their bags in the cockpit, the captain looked through the technical logbook and saw that the aircraft was completely clean, with no recent technical issues logged. After that, it was time to start the pre-flight inspection, which in United Airlines is always done by the first officer. So he went outside and started his normal clockwise inspection, where he checked that all of the probe covers were removed, that there were no leaks, indications of bird strikes or any other damages to any of the components, and he spent quite a long time checking each engine to make sure that the giant fan blades had no damages on them. You see, even tiny damages can cause vibrations and loss of thrust, so this is something that we pilots always pay attention to. But everything looked completely normal, so he finished his walk around and then returned to the cockpit for the rest of the pre-flight. As the pilots arrived to the aircraft, they had also been met up by another colleague, First Officer Ed Gagarin, who wanted to ask if he could hitch a ride with them back to Honolulu. He had just finished an earlier shift and was eager to get back home for his rest days, but he had also seen that the flight was almost fully booked, so he asked if there was any chance that he could join the pilots in the cockpit. Captain Benham greeted him happily and joked that if he was going to sit up front, he might also have to do some work, and they both laughed, not knowing just how true this would actually turn out to be. Now, Ed also mentioned that he had just completed his line training, and that's a fact that will soon come to play a very important role in this story. In any case, whilst First Officer Paul was out doing his walk-around, Captain Benham continued setting up the aircraft for departure, so when Paul got back into the cockpit, they could immediately start briefing and preparing for their departure. At this point, Captain Benham also asked if Paul had any preferences on who should act as pilot flying for the leg, and Paul answered that he would love to do that since he wanted to get some experience on this route. So, that's what they decided to do, and soon the lead purser popped her head into the cockpit and advised them that all passengers had been boarded and that the crew was ready to go. This meant that there were now 363 passengers and 15 crew members on board the aircraft. The pilots completed their last few checklists as well as their briefing for a departure from runway 28 left, and soon after that, First Officer Paul requested pushback from stand 80, they started their engines and then taxied out towards the runway holding point. All checks were completed in a normal way with no anomalies noted, so at time 0938 Pacific Standard Time, after a grueling 38-minute taxi, First Officer Paul finally moved the thrust levers forward for takeoff and the giant Boeing 777 started accelerating down the runway. The takeoff and initial climb were completely uneventful, and once the gear and flaps were retracted, the flight soon received their clearance to join their oceanic route towards Honolulu, which is actually one of the longest uninterrupted overwater routes in the world. There are other routes who are longer, but they all have alternate airports on islands along the way, whilst the stretch between San Francisco and Honolulu is just over water. The aircraft climbed in steps up towards its final cruise altitude of flight level 380 or 38,000 feet, and once up there, the crew started completing their paperwork and then chit-chatted a bit between themselves about their previous experience and plans that they had for the week ahead. The first 3 hours and 30 minutes of the flight continued in the same standard way, with only position reports, fuel checks and ACARS messages sent regarding weather and wind, and Captain Benham chuckled about the fact that he had flown to Honolulu countless times in his career so far, but he had never seen a solid covering cloud layer stretching from 2,000 to 33,000 feet over the islands as they were now planning to see. Soon, they entered an area of light to moderate turbulence and therefore asked Honolulu Control if they could descend 2,000 feet down to flight level 360 in order to try to get out of it. This was approved, and First Officer Paul dialed it in on the mode control panel and let the autopilot initiate a cruise descent, the same way as he had done thousands of times before. They were now about 200 nautical miles northeast of Honolulu, with around 40 minutes of the flight still remaining, when the crack in the number 11 fan blade had reached a point of no return. Within a millisecond, the giant fan blade separated in a clean cut about 3.5 centimeters above its root. It shot outwards with an incredible force and almost immediately impacted the adjoining blade, which also shattered and went inwards into the engine core, raising even more havoc in there. The number 11 fan blade then started moving forward inside of the protective barrel, and when it hit the edges it created multiple high-energy shock waves which ultimately exceeded the certified specifications of the forward inner barrel as well as the cowling. This meant that those parts soon failed and were then immediately ripped off the engine. This is known as a fan blade out or FBO event, and it's something that the engines are tested to be able to sustain during certification. The protective barrel directly surrounding the blades are constructed from incredibly durable Kevlar, but the forward barrel and the aerodynamic engine cowling is not. It later turned out that parts of the engine inlet used during certification testing had been made out of aluminium, which had a greater ability to yield and deform than the carbon fiber reinforced polymer that was the part that was ultimately used in production. That was found to be one of the reasons for the quick destruction of the forward parts, while the Kevlar casing actually stayed reasonably intact. But when those forward sections of the engine disappeared, parts of the fan blade, which was still spiraling forward, managed to escape the encasement and shot straight into the side of the aircraft. But through an incredible act of luck, they impacted the body exactly at the place where a stringer, a structural part of the body, was located just below one of the passenger windows. This meant that the blade fragments didn't puncture the cabin, which could have been catastrophic for the passenger sitting next to it, and even worse, would have caused an immediate depressurization of the aircraft. Luckily, that didn't happen, but in the cockpit, none of the pilots had any idea of what had just crippled their aircraft. They only heard an enormous explosion, and then it felt like the aircraft had literally hit a brick wall. The deceleration was so severe that Captain Benham and First Officer Ayers almost slammed their heads into their glare shield, and within 1.5 seconds, the aircraft had lurched into a 45-degree right bank, whilst also yawing sharply in the same direction. This was incredibly disorienting, as it all happened very fast and literally came from nowhere and with no prior warning. 1 second, they were flying along nicely, and in the next, their aircraft was literally snap-rolling over its right wing and shaking like it was about to break up. Captain Benham, being the training captain that he was, immediately realized the gravity of the situation and called out, "I have controls." He grasped the control wheel as the autopilot and autothrottle both disengaged, and then glanced down onto his engine displays to confirm what he thought must be a catastrophic engine failure. When he did that, he saw to his amazement that the engine instruments both showed completely normal values. So he called out, What happened?" to get some help identifying the failure, and First Officer Paul Ayer just responded, "I don't know, the engine instruments are normal." In the corner of his eye, Captain Benham now also saw how the airspeed, who just a few seconds ago had been steadily at Mach 0.83, had started slowing down rapidly, and he knew that he now had very little time to react. Whatever this was, it was coming from the right side, as the aircraft was both yawing and rolling that way, so he instinctively pushed left rudder and gently gave maximum ailerons towards the left. All he could think about was trying to keep the blue side up on his primary flight display, whilst also pushing the left thrust lever all the way forward to get as much thrust as he possibly could to slow down the deceleration. At these altitudes, it's very important to not move the controls too fast, as that can cause Mach shock waves to form, and the fact that the aircraft was already banking 45 degrees meant that they were already experiencing higher than normal G-forces, something that also increases the aircraft's stall speed. Ed, the first officer on the jump seat, now called out, maybe we've had an in-flight collision." Now that would definitely explain the explosion, extreme vibrations and sudden loss of controls that they were now experiencing, but they were at 36,000 feet and had seen nothing on their TCAS. There just shouldn't be anyone else at that altitude. You see, above 18,000 feet in the US, all airspace is controlled with mandatory transponder use, so if there would have been anyone else up there, they should have seen it. Anyway, with full deflection on both rudder and aileron, the stricken 777 now started slowly rolling back towards wings level again, but with the airspeed still decreasing. All of this, except for the strange engine indications, were typical for a severe engine failure, and Captain Benham knew that if this was the case, the aircraft would not be able to maintain its altitude for much longer. A twin-engine jet can, depending on type and weight, normally keep an altitude of around 21 to 24,000 feet on one engine, but never 36,000. This meant that he needed to start descending immediately, otherwise the aircraft would soon stall and he could potentially completely lose control. On top of all of this, they were now shaking so badly that the pilots had problems focusing their eyes enough to see their instruments in front of them and to reach for specific controls. And meanwhile this was happening, a sickening sound of twisting metal could be heard from behind them, a sound similar to what you would hear in a sinking submarine as the pressure starts crushing it. 35 seconds after the start of this nightmare, the engine instruments for the right-hand engine suddenly started blanking one by one. What had actually happened was that the entire EEC, the computer in charge of reporting values to the engine instruments, had been ripped away when the engine cowling separated. So what the pilots had been looking at was just the last reported values from the engine before the failure had occurred, which had stuck in the screen's memory due to a lack of other inputs. This finally confirmed to the crew that they were indeed dealing with some kind of severe damage to the right-hand engine, and Captain Benham therefore asked First Officer Paul to please start executing the engine's severe damage checklist from the ECL, their electronic checklist. In other aircraft, like the Boeing 737 that I fly, this type of failure includes something known as memory items, meaning items that has to be done from memory without reference to a checklist. But in the 777, this instead had to be done from their internal electronic checklist in their ACAS. But the problem now was that the aircraft was shaking so badly that the first officer simply couldn't reach to use the ACAS at all. And this is where experience once again comes in. You see, both pilots had been operating with memory items in previous aircraft, which meant that they now could just go through them from memory. So Paul started reading out: outer throttle, confirm, off, off. Engine thrust lever, confirm, close, close. Engine start lever, confirm, cut off, cut off. All three pilots made sure that they didn't rush these steps, because previous accidents had taught them that it's very easy to misidentify a failure like this and end up shutting down the wrong engine. Once these items had been completed, the vibrations subsided slightly, but were still very bad, so they all agreed to add one more point to the checklist: to pull the engine fire switch. This step would completely isolate the right engine and shut off all of its fuel, oil and hydraulics. So they looked at each other. Number 2, fire handle, confirm, pull, confirmed, and they pulled it. Once this step was done, the vibrations finally reduced from about 15 on a scale from 1 to 10 down to about 7. Still really bad, terrifying for the passengers, but now at least manageable. Using their ACAS and their electronic checklist was still very hard, so instead Ed on the jump seat pulled up his iPad and started running through the checklist verbally. Remember, he was still fresh out of training and he was therefore really familiar with all of these checklists from his recent sim, and this turned out to be a great help. Now, here it's probably a good idea to also look at how this crew were dividing their different roles. Captain Benham was still hand-flying the aircraft, and even though he had been able to slightly reduce the amount of aileron and rudder input, he was still using a lot, and it took up most of his capacity to just keep the aircraft straight and reasonably level. Because of that, he took full advantage of all available resources in the cockpit, which included his jump-seating colleague, Ed, who was tasked with helping First Officer Paul with everything that he needed, including the checklists, performance calculations and overall monitoring. Captain Benham made it absolutely clear that he had very limited capacity to oversee the checklist handling, which he would normally do, so he was concentrating on aviating and would continue to do so for as long as it would take. By being very clear here and by delegating effectively, the crew was able to contain a catastrophic failure within a very quick time frame. This serves as an excellent example of how crew resource management is supposed to work, and also a great adherence to the golden rule of aviation: aviate, navigate, communicate. This meant that the next step was to navigate and communicate. Captain Benham asked Ed if he could call in the emergency to air traffic control and make them aware of the fact that they were now descending. Ed immediately complied and called Mayday to Honolulu Control, telling them that United Airlines Flight 1175 were suffering from some type of severe damage and needed to proceed directly towards the airport whilst also descending. This was followed by a long pause by air traffic control. It clearly took a while for the controller to really appreciate the gravity of what he had just heard. He eventually came back with, "Say again?" just to verify that this was actually happening, but he then quickly found his composure and asked the crew for the number of souls on board as well as the fuel remaining. Those are standard questions needed to prepare the emergency services for a possible worst-case scenario, and is almost always asked in a situation like this. And Ed gave him that information, but after he had done that, all three pilots just looked at each other for a few seconds. It had just sunk in that there were over 350 people on board this flight. Whole families, possibly whole villages, whose lives were likely affecting many thousands more. They just had to get this aircraft safely down on the ground. Now, I normally advise against letting emotions get involved when dealing with sudden and complicated emergencies, because generally it's better to try and fall back onto trained procedures and decision-making models, as emotions have a way of increasing stress to levels where effective decision-making can become very difficult. But in this case, it seems to have worked as a catalyst for the crew to maintain even higher focus. The aircraft was now steadily descending, and Captain Benham asked his first officer to calculate the best speed and altitude for a drift-down procedure. This is something that we use when we want to maximize our time at higher altitudes and therefore extend our range as much as possible. Whilst Paul was calculating the values, they also quickly determined that the best airport for landing would be their destination, Honolulu, but it was still around 200 nautical miles away, and they had no idea how damaged their aircraft was or how long it would stay together. This meant that they would need to drift it down gently to make sure they wouldn't make the damages worse, and also to maximize their chances of actually reaching the airport. Captain Benham had already firewalled the remaining left engine when the explosion occurred, and that's something that we normally only do in extreme circumstances, like in a terrain escape maneuver. If we do that, we only keep it firewalled for a limited amount of time to not overstress the engine, but Captain Benham now felt that he needed all the thrust he could possibly get in order to keep the aircraft under control. So the engine was just left firewalled at full thrust. First Officer Paul soon determined that the best speed and altitude for a drift down would be 230 knots and 23,000 feet. By decelerating to that speed with maximum thrust set, this would keep the aircraft descending with minimum possible vertical speed. But as Captain Benham started decelerating the aircraft and the speed started getting back towards 245 knots, the aircraft suddenly started shaking even more, and soon the stick shaker also activated. They were about to stall. Now, that shouldn't have been happening at that speed, but here it was, happening anyway, and all pilots are taught that the only way to get out of an impending stall is to immediately lower the angle of attack. Captain Benham reacted instinctively and immediately lowered the nose, but by doing so, the vertical speed increased to 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute, and if that descent rate were to be continued, the aircraft would hit the water way before reaching Honolulu. So, what was going on here? Why was the aircraft stalling at such a high airspeed where the drift-down tables were suggesting an even lower speed to fly? Well, when those tables were made, they were calculated with single-engine performance, but with the non-functioning engine still in one piece. What this crew was now dealing with was a severely damaged engine, missing most of its aerodynamical fairings that would guide the air smoothly past the cowling and then over the wing. What this meant was that the airflow was now severely interrupted over the right wing, which lowered the amount of lift that wing could produce. That was actually what had caused that rapid roll to the right as the explosion occurred, and was now also causing the much higher stall speed on that wing that they were now experiencing. But the pilots still had no idea about this. The Boeing 777 has no external cameras that can be accessed from the cockpit, so whilst stabilizing the aircraft at a slightly higher airspeed, around 245 to 255 knots, Captain Benham now took another decision. He asked Ed, the jump-seating first officer, if he could go back through the cabin and have a look at the state of the engine and then report back. Ed nodded and immediately started making his way back towards the aircraft's midsection, close to the wings, and a few minutes later he came back with a truly terrifying video on his mobile phone. In it, the full scale of the damage could be clearly seen, and also how the damaged fan was still windmilling with the whole engine oscillating from side to side due to the unusual aerodynamic forces that was now acting upon it. There was no way of telling how long this engine would actually stay connected to the airframe, or if the departing debris had damaged any other part of the aircraft behind it as it disintegrated. With the airspeed now under control and the stick shaker quiet, the descent rate had dropped to a more manageable 1,000 to 1,200 feet per minute as the aircraft descended through roughly 33,000 feet. At this point, they entered the thick cloud layer which they had seen during their pre-flight briefing, which also meant that they would now lose all outside visual references until they broke out of the clouds at around 2,000 feet, hopefully close to the airport. But what about what was happening behind them then? What about the cabin crew and passengers? Well, this would have been an absolutely terrifying experience for all of them. During the first 15 minutes of this emergency, the pilots were completely consumed by controlling the aircraft, securing the engine and finding a safe new flight envelope to maintain, and this meant that none of them had had any chance to make a PA to the passengers to reassure them and explain to them what was going on. All passengers who were sitting on the right side of the aircraft close to the wings were able to clearly see the mangled engine rocking forth and back outside their windows, and this, combined with the absolutely extreme initial vibrations, would have likely scared even me if I was on board. As the situation got more and more under control, Captain Benham asked the lead purser to come into the flight deck to give her a briefing by himself and to project some calm onto the situation. He was very transparent and explained that they had suffered severe damage to the right engine and possibly to even more parts of the aircraft that he couldn't see. He also told her to start preparing the passengers for a possible ditching at sea. He did this because he knew that the cabin crew procedure needed to do this could last as long as 25 minutes, which was more or less exactly the time he calculated that they had left airborne. And he also informed her that they would be calling brace, brace, brace about 2 minutes prior to landing. Now, Captain Benham didn't actually think at this point that they would have to ditch, but he didn't know just how the aircraft would react when they started slowing it down for landing and extending flaps. And on top of that, he knew that there would be no harm in having the cabin prepared for the worst case scenario. Again, this is excellent thinking on behalf of the captain. It's always better to be safe than sorry, and this way the cabin crew would be busy with their drills, which would also keep them and the passengers occupied, and prepare them mentally for an evacuation if that would be needed later on. After this point, all communications with both air traffic control, the cabin crew and the passengers were delegated to Ed on the jump seat so that the two pilots could focus solely on getting the aircraft safely down on the ground. The flight attendants ended up doing an absolutely fantastic job, caring for the passengers and preparing the cabin for the coming emergency landing, whilst Ed kept updating them every 10 minutes or so about the progress. Air traffic control also did a great job by not overburdening the pilots with questions and just giving them the info and clearances that they asked for, and kept all of the other traffic out of the way. Now, notice how all members of this situation worked like one big organism, utilizing each other's strength, keeping each other updated without overburdening anyone with questions and non-essential information. For any budding pilots, or really anyone out there, this is a behavior that's really worth remembering. I also want to point out here that this scenario would have felt very different from any training scenario that this crew had ever encountered in the simulator. The simulators are not equipped to simulate the level of vibration that they were now experiencing, and on top of this engine failure behaved very differently from the way that it was normally simulated. The changed aerodynamics from the mangled engine also impacted the way that the aircraft needed to be handled, and several systems, including the EECs, the fire loops and all automatics, had been removed by the explosion. But even though this was so different, the hundreds of simulator hours that these pilots had accumulated together, as well as the thousands of hours of actual flight experience they shared, had created something known as resilience. Resilience is where you can utilize all of your previous knowledge and experience to tackle completely new situations that you might face. Other great examples of resilience was the miracle of the Hudson and Qantas Flight 32, both of which I have previously covered on this channel. And this, by the way, is also exactly the kind of things that I love to discuss with my Patreons on our monthly Zoom Hangouts. Please consider joining you too if you want to support me and my team and take part of the work that we do. Anyway, First Officer Phil now also got into contact with the airline via SATCOM and briefed the operations officer about what was going on so that the airline could start getting their crisis center ready. Meanwhile, Captain Benham kept counting in his head. If he could just continue descending with around 1,000 to 1,200 feet per minute with the distance and speed that they now had, they should be able to reach the airport. By getting a direct routing towards the final, they had also saved around 7 minutes of flight time, which could become crucial if it turned out that they couldn't arrest the descent rate down towards the end. So at this point, it was all about continuing to fly and also start getting the aircraft ready for the landing. More and more non-normal checklists also started popping up on their ACAS, which the crew needed to take into account. Since they had been flying with max thrust set on the still working left engine, it had consumed much more fuel than expected, which also meant that they were eating into their diversion fuel. On top of this had also caused a fuel imbalance between the left and the right main tanks, since the left engine was only using fuel from the left-hand side. All of this was being dealt with by First Officers Paul and Ed, whilst Captain Benham was completely focused on just keeping this stricken bird flying. The two first officers started cross-feeding fuel from the right tank to the left engine as they passed around 10,000 feet descending, and at this point Ed also fastened the shoulder harnesses on Captain Benham's seatbelt, since he wasn't able to do this himself due to the sheer difficulty of the handling that he was experiencing. After this, it was also time to start briefing the approach, so Ed took the weather for Honolulu, which still was overcast but with thankfully good visibility and winds for landing. Honolulu approach soon handed them over to the Honolulu tower frequency, and when First Officer Paul called them up, they were advised that they could expect radar vectors for an ILS approach into runway 04 right. But that was no good. Both Captain Benham and Ed on the jump seat were familiar with the airport and knew that runway 04 right was quite short and wouldn't be long enough for the high-speed single-engine approach that they now had ahead of them. Runway 08 left was long enough, but unfortunately closed for some type of work on that day, so Paul instead asked for vectors towards runway 08 right, a long enough runway but unfortunately without an ILS approach. On that runway, there was only a non-precision, GPS-based RNAV approach available, meaning that the crew would now soon have to fly a manual, single-engine, non-precision approach in full instrument conditions, accompanied by some of the heaviest vibrations that they had ever experienced. Quite a challenge. But Captain Benham wasn't worrying too much about that yet. He was more focused on making the runway in the first place. He asked Paul to tell air traffic control to give them vectors as close to land as possible, since the waves might be smaller on the lee side of the island and therefore more survivable in case they would have to attempt a ditching. Now this is something that I think that a lot of people might not fully appreciate. You see, landing in water with an airliner of this size would be an extremely challenging maneuver to successfully achieve. Landing on water in any situation is hard, but if you have a stretch of smooth water like Captain Sully had in the Miracle of the Hudson, it's still reasonably doable. Trying to do so in the massive waves of the Pacific Ocean is a completely different ballgame, and Captain Benham knew this, so trying to overfly calmer waters was a really smart thing to do. Now, the tower controller initially tried to tell the pilots to level off at various altitudes, but this was turned down by the crew. They still needed full thrust on the left engine to maintain speed in a descent and did not want to end up in another approach to stall situation by leveling off for no good reason. Once the controller understood this, he just left them alone with free range to intercept the RNAV approach at their own discretion. And here again, the crew showed evidence of remarkable teamwork. Since the captain was solely focused on just handling the massive shaking bird, the two first officers together started setting up and briefing for the approach. And all three pilots decided that Ed, from the jump seat, would be acting as kind of a precision approach radar, or PAR, based on what he saw on the navigation display. This meant that he would be telling Captain Benham how to turn and descend, kind of like turn right onto heading 075 degrees, now continue straight ahead, increase descent rate, etc. He did this all to minimize the workload and to try to stabilize the approach as much as possible. Now this is not taught anywhere, but a great adaptation to a situation and the use of resources, and yet another reason why it's a poor idea to try to reduce the number of pilots in the cockpit. As they were intercepting the approach, they kept the aircraft slightly high and fast on purpose to make sure that they would have enough energy to make the runway even if something further would happen. Remember, they were still not sure how the aircraft would react when they started extending the flaps and gear, or if it would be even possible based on the damages that they had. When First Officer Paul started briefing the missed approach procedure, Captain Benham softly stopped him. "Paul, there will be no missed approach. We are using full thrust on the left engine just to keep the speed in descent. If we get the flaps and gear out, we will only have one chance to land this thing." Now, if you think that he was being over-dramatic here, he wasn't. He had previously sent Ed out to also check on the back of the aircraft as he felt like the aircraft wasn't handling properly, even with the damaged right engine in mind. When Ed came back from that second check, he had said that the back of the aircraft was fishtailing left to right so violently that he had problems even focusing to see the panicked faces of the passengers in the back. This had led the crew to expect that there might also be further damage to the tail, which they couldn't see, and it was very hard to say just how long this aircraft would stay together. They needed to land it as soon as possible. Now, they had decided to try and land with 20 degrees of flaps using a speed of 145 knots in the final, provided they were able to decelerate that much with the aircraft still flying. As they descended down the extended approach, they now gently started slowing down, which would also meant more and more rudder needed from the captain as the rudder becomes less and less aerodynamically efficient as the speed decreases. They extended one step of flaps, then two, and the aircraft was thankfully still behaving okay. At time 12:34 Honolulu time, the huge 777 finally broke through the clouds and the pilots could see the runway straight ahead. First Officer Paul reported this to the tower and were immediately clear to land. All emergency equipment was now standing by for them. 20 seconds later, they selected the landing gear down and soon received 3 green lights indicating that it was all down and locked. This was a huge relief for everyone as the aircraft was still maintaining its speed reasonably well even with this added drag. When they passed 500 feet, First Officer Paul called out "Brace, brace, brace" of the PA to make sure all passengers and crew were ready in the brace position for the landing, and immediately after this, flaps 20 was selected. Now they were only seconds away from the landing. The giant 777 finally swooped in over the threshold and was immediately followed by the emergency vehicles who were waiting for them. Captain Benham was now in a trance-like state, and all he could focus on was getting this aircraft down gently, not to cause any further damage and to start braking. He had to get this right. At time 12:37 and 15 seconds, the main landing gear touched down so smoothly that some of the people on board didn't even notice it. Captain Benham immediately started to gently brake, and he later said that this was one of the best landings that he had done in his entire career. The aircraft slowed down to taxi speed and rolled gently out onto taxiway Romeo Golf, where it was brought to a complete stop. First Officer Paul looked over towards Captain Benham and said to him, "You can let go now, Captain," because he saw that his captain was still squeezing the controls and thrust levels as hard as he had been doing during the last 40 minutes. Now, it was time to do the next step, since an emergency is not over just because the aircraft has landed. The crew got into contact with the emergency services, who were now assessing the aircraft from the outside, and was soon told that apart from a small hydraulic leak, there was nothing else requiring an immediate evacuation. The crew acknowledged this and passed that information on to air traffic control, who gave them a clearance to continue taxiing on their own power onto stand. And once they reached there, the shocked passengers and crew erupted in cheers as the engine was finally turned off. And that thought actually brings some tears to my eyes when I think about it. Anyway, everyone then disembarked normally and were met by the emergency response team from United Airlines at the gate. The pilots had exited the cockpit at that point to say goodbye to each one of the passengers. Some were crying, some were trying to show a brave face, but towards the end, a blonde little girl came up to the captain and told him with a smile, "That was so cool, best roller coaster ride ever," before she exited together with her presumably less impressed mother. Life is all about perspectives. Now, as soon as they had landed, the phones of the pilots all started lighting up with calls from the company. But they were well aware of the procedure they needed to follow. When something like this happened, first of all, they should always call their union hotline to get the appropriate legal advice. It is really important not to say the wrong things in these situations, so as sad as it sounds, this is what we all should do. The cockpit voice recorder was also protected, something that would become crucial for the coming investigation, together with the flight data recorder, and after having shut everything down correctly and made the appropriate tech log entries, the crew left the aircraft. Outside, the pilots followed the engineers and mechanics around to look at the damage, and they took some photos, some of which you can see here. Both pilots were initially grounded on full pay, pending investigation, which is standard protocol, but they were soon back in the air again with only the finest comments from the airline. The investigation showed that the catastrophic engine failure had been caused by the fatigue crack that I explained about before, and it shone a very harsh light on the TAI inspection procedure, where the inspectors had been seeing but not highlighting this crack several years earlier. This led to several improvements on this procedure, as well as an increased inspection interval of the fan blades of these particular engines and the additive of a stronger engine containment structure. Unfortunately though, this didn't stop a very similar accident from happening at a later point, also including a United Boeing 777, which increased this scrutiny even further. And in a very funny twist, the passengers on board that second aircraft was after the incident booked onto a new aircraft to complete the trip, and that aircraft was the very same aircraft that I've told you about in this story, which had been returned to service after repairs. It really is a very small world. Now, the actions of these pilots have been used as positive CRM stories for training both by United and other airlines after this thing happened, and Captain Christopher Benham and First Officer Paul Ayer were on the 18th of July 2019 awarded the Superior Airmanship Award by the Airline Pilots Association for their skill and teamwork in this accident. Now, there is also another reason why I've chosen to make this video right now in my summer house in Sweden during vacation, and that is that on the 8th of August this year, 2024, Captain Christopher Benham made his very last commercial flight before retirement. He flew together with his family to London, where his dream of becoming an airline pilot had originally started. And on behalf of my entire team, I would like to send our heartfelt congratulations to Christopher for a career well served, as well as our best wishes for his retirement. Very few pilots are ever put in the ultimate challenge of their skills and knowledge, and you should be proud of the way that you and your team handled it on this day. Captain Benham has also written a book about this experience and his life, and it's a really great book. I will put a link to it in the description below, where you can also find links to my merch and my Patreon crew. That's just an incredible story, which always touches me deeply whenever I see it. Now, I make 2 and sometimes 3 Mentor pilot videos per month, and since I always discuss accidents and incidents, it can sometimes give the impression that these type of events happens quite regularly. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, if I would use this channel to accurately depict how the commercial aviation actually looks, well then I should also tell you the story of every single flight that safely takes off and lands as well as the incident ones. And if I would do that, well then it would take this channel over 220,000 years to show a single deadly accident, and then another 220,000 years to the next. Now, to give you some perspective, that's how long it's been since the last ice age, or since the first Homo sapiens appeared in Africa. So that's how safe flying really is today, and that's largely down to the incredible skills, knowledge, flexibility and resilience of the people working in this industry. Remember that.